Hey guys, what's going on? It's Jace of the Forestry Project. In today's video, I want to kind of continue what we were talking about last week in identifying trees and look at specifically, we're going to be identifying what species this is by using our Dichotomous key that we have in this book. Now, this is the same book that I showed you last week. I'm going to again include a comment with the link for this book so that you can get it for yourself. But having a dichotomous key can be very important. So let's dive into it. Let's first look at what a dichotomous key looks like, and then explain some of our thinking, and finish up by identifying this tree. So let's get into it. Alright, so in this book here, it goes through what we discussed as far as compound, simple, leaf shapes, margins, buds. Goes through some flowers, a little bit of ecology, and now we get to the keys. So this has a summertime and a wintertime key, but we'll be using the summertime key since it's starting to get summer out. And just generally, you'll go through, if it's needles, you'll go to group A, that's your conifers. If it's not needles, you'll go to 2, you'll follow that down, whether it's simple, compound, opposite, alternate, you can go through and give you group B, group C, group D, and then you can just start going through, and based off of leaf shape, twigs, branches, buds, fruit, you can start going through and deciding on this. And say, like for instance, here you'll go to 6, tells you to go to 6, you'll go through if it has the twigs encircled at the nodes with stipule scars, that would be your magnolia family. Whereas not, you'll go to number 7, and then it just keeps narrowing it down as it goes. So let's think about how it would narrow down, and let's look at some visuals. Now that we've looked at that, it always helps me to visualize what I'm thinking about, and especially when it comes down to, if you consider all the trees that we've been talking about, if you try to think of all of their leaves at the same time, it would be confusing, and that's where the dichotomous key comes in. So let's visualize what it looks like when we start to decide what leaves go with which. And to do that, we're going to be using a very high-tech leaf recreation software is what we will call it. Really, it's just I drew them out, cut them out, and then photoshopped them. So here it is, but let's kick that up on the screen and see what that looks like. So here we have all of the plants that we've been talking about, and you can see there's needles, there's compound leaves, simple leaves, opposite, alternate, all of them in one. Now we want to start actually differentiating those and splitting them up into separate little groups, and that's going to look something like what we're going to go through. Now first, I want to separate the needles from the broadleaves, and that would look like this. So you have your needles over here, your broadleaves over here. Now we're going to go back to the broadleaves, but let's look at the needles for a second and see how we can break them down further. Now if you have your needles, we can essentially split them up into 2 groups. You're going to have your needles, then you're going to have your awl-like leaves, and that'll look like this. So you can see my needles, these are all pine needles, and then my awl-like needles. These are the cedars and the cypresses. So let's first look at the needles and see how we can start to differentiate them. Now here are our 4 pine needles, and the 2 key things, the 2 key characteristics to look for is how many needles per fascicle. So you have your 3 needles per fascicle and your 2 needles per fascicle. Now we can look at length. So in your 3 needles per fascicle, that's going to be your L pine, so your loblolly and longleaf. And longleaf pine is going to have a longer needle than your loblolly pine. Now if we look at the 2 needles per fascicle, your slash and your shortleaf, your slash pine is going to have longer needles than your shortleaf. So here we can now see that you have your slash and your shortleaf. So that's how we start breaking needles down. Now let's go back to the awl-like leaves and see how we can differentiate them. So if you have your awl-like leaves, You can have it on a flat plane, like you're going to see in your cedars and your cypress, your bald cypress. But your bald cypress is going to have rounder leaves than your cedar will, and that's how we can differentiate those. But then your pond cypress is going to have leaves that don't sit on one plane. As you can see, they kind of come out from anywhere around the stem. So that is how we can start separating out the awl-like leaves, and that gets into our needles and our awl-like leaves. So now let's go back to the broadleaves and see how we can start to split those up. So now we have all the broadleaves again. And if we were to consider all of these again, it would be way too time consuming. So let's start to break this down into simple things that we can start to look at that's very easily recognizable. So first we want to filter out the compound leaves, and at first just look at the simple leaves, and that's going to look like this. So now that we have our simple leaves, in these you're going to have a couple characteristics. You're going to have opposite versus alternate, and then you're going to have lobed versus non-lobed. So first let's split it out, opposite versus alternate, and then we'll get into what the lobes are. So here you have your opposite leaves, here you have your alternate leaves, and that just merely means if you look, you can see where two leaves are come out at the same area on the stem in your opposite, whereas the leaves are alternating coming out of the stem in your alternate. So if we look at the opposite, once we decide that, how did then we start looking at stuff, and that's where the lobes come into play. So here we have our two opposite leaves, and we have a dogwood and a red maple. Now dogwood's going to have a broader leaf, it's wider than your red maple sometimes, and it's got a completely different shape, but your red maple is going to have lobes. Now sometimes you'll get a very faint 5-lobe, but typically it's 3. And you can see that that's kind of a differentiating feature among red maple. To even differentiate it from other maples is those 3 lobes. So once we started splitting it down, we can actually start looking at the lobes, getting into margins and everything else to decide what tree it is. Now let's go back and look at the alternate leaves and see how lobes can affect us there. So here's our alternate leaves. And again, we'll separate it out by lobes. So here are our lobed leaves, and here are our non-lobed leaves. Let's look at the lobed leaves. These are all oak species, and see how we can differentiate those. Now, if you look at the lobes on oaks specifically, and I talked about this in the last video, white oak leaves are going to have rounded lobes, and that's any oak in the white oak family. And then any oak in your red oak family is going to have pointed lobes. So over here we have white oak leaves, a white oak and a post oak. And over here we have red oak leaves, a northern red oak and a black oak. So if we look at these, we can start to look at the shape of the lobes and how the leaf is laid out to decide. So if we look at the white oak leaves, the post oak has more of a cross-shaped leaf. So it comes out and then it has a very wide set of lobes that kind of looks like it forms a cross. Whereas the white oak has more just lobes coming out. They look a little bit more slightly asymmetrical, but still mostly symmetrical, if that makes any sense. Now, if we look at the red oaks, however, we can see that they kind of look similar. You could kind of see where, you might get a little bit confused with them. But we can look at the northern red oak has a very narrow base. So if we look at the northern red oak on the far end, it's got a very narrow base, whereas the black oak, the leaf kind of comes out and just immediately widens out. So that's another differentiating feature, that you can just look at leaf shape. Even if they have lobes, the leaf shape may be a little bit different. So now, what do you do if the leaf doesn't have lobes? Here we have 2 leaves, they don't have lobes, but they have serrated margins. So we can look, both of them have serrated margins. One has a doubly serrate margin, one has a just serrated margin. So that's one way you can tell the 2 apart. Now another way is, and I did a horrible job drawing this. But if you look at the elm leaf over here, it has an inequilateral base of the leaf. So one side of the leaf curves out a lot, one side really doesn't. And I pointed that out in the last video, but I wanted to show you compared to a leaf that doesn't, and then I drew the black cherry that did. But over here we have a black cherry, and it has a little bit more symmetrical base on it. It's not inequilateral that one is really shaped odd. Now, don't judge my drawing based off of that, because again, I kind of drew it with a little bit of an inequilateral base, but you can start to do that, and some leaves are going to change. So there's always that to consider, and that's where you want to look at multiple leaves, try to get on multiple branches instead of just looking at one place. Well, now that we've talked about the simple leaves, let's see how we can contrast that comparing the compound leaves and how we decide how to break those apart. So if you have all your compound leaves, here we're going to split them up into three basic groups, just like I did in the last video: your pinnately compound, your palmately compound, and your trifoliate. So over here we have trifoliate, and there's one mistake in this that I do want to correct. In the middle we have our palmately compound leaves, and then we have our pinnately compound leaves. But we can start to look at, again, opposite versus alternate branching. So up in your top over here we have poison ivy. Now it's going to have alternate branching, and that's kind of how you can start to tell it apart. Trifoliate leaves, alternate branching, especially if it has a very hairy vine, probably don't want to touch it. Now, this box elder down here, I've grouped in the trifoliate compound, and I did in the last video by mistake. It is actually a pinnately compound leaf, and I'll explain why. So box elder can actually have 3 or 5 leaves, or leaflets per leaf. And the ones we looked at were 3, so it kind of fit that trifoliate bill. Now, most box elders are going to have 3, but they can have 5. So in all reality, we really should put it into the pinnately compound, and I will in just a second discuss how we can break those apart. Now, if we look at the palmately compound, again, we can look at alternate versus opposite. So up top, we have a buckeye. It is opposite. And then below that, we have a Virginia creeper, and it is alternate. So that is how we start to break those apart. Depending on the species, you can also look at margins again. All of that then comes back into play. Let's look at pinnately compound leaves specifically and how we can start looking at those though. So on your pinnately compound leaves, you can again split them into opposite versus alternate, and that breaks it down a little bit. So alternate's going to be your hickories, your walnuts, pecans, all of those. So you can see this has the alternate leaves on it. Now let's look at the opposite and see how we can break it down, since now we're including the box elder in it. So if we look at it, we can see an ash and a box elder. Now the easiest way to differentiate those is by the number of leaflets. They're both opposite, so let's look at an ash is going to have 7 leaflets. You're going to have 3 sets and then 1 terminal leaflet. Whereas the box elder is either going to have 5 or 3 leaflets total. So typically you'll see 1 pair and 1 of your terminal leaflets. Other times you may see 2 pairs of leaflets and then your terminal leaflet. So that's another way we can start to break those apart. And I hope visualizing this has helped you kind of understand how we break it apart using a dichotomous key. Let's get back out to the field and see how we actually use a dichotomous key to identify this tree. So now that we've looked at some visuals, let's go back to the beginning of the summer key and let's identify what tree this is. So if we look at it, we can see a truncate base, slightly V-shaped tip. It is lobed, and if you look right down here, you can see that it's alternate leafing, not opposite. So let's put this right here so we can look at it, and let's start going down. So we know it's not a needle, so it's not a needle. We'll go to 2. 2, leaves very large, 4 to 7 feet long. That's not it. Leaves less than 4 foot long. There we go. Says go to 3, so you'll go to 3. Leaf simple or leaf compound, or these are simple leaves, so we'll go to fir, and that's going to be opposite or alternate. We know it's alternate, so now we need to go to group C. It's on page 31. So starting here at 31, leaves thick, evergreen, or totally deciduous. It's not that. So if it was that, you would go through here. Since it's not, we'll go and we'll find the next number 1. Okay, 1. Leaves deciduous. Yep, so it says go to 19. 19. Uppermost lateral buds clustered. Fruit and acorn. Nope. Fruit not an acorn. It says go to 20. Twigs armed, which means it's going to be spiky. It's not that. Twigs not armed. There we go. It says go down to 25. Leaves lobed, or with lobed and unlobed leaves on the same tree. It does have lobes. You can see the lobes here. So it would be 26. Leaves truncate or V-shaped. Well, they're truncate and they have a V-shaped tip. Flower and fruit, flower yellow-green, tulip-shaped, fruit of samara in a cone-like aggregation. Now, that you have to see the tree, and depending on the tree, I encourage you to take this out in the woods with you, and you can identify it, but since it's raining, I kind of wanted to stay a little bit covered. And we can see that, yes, it's like that. So now we're going to go to Liriodendron tulipifera, which is page 232. Now, one thing to note, this uses scientific names, and you can get lists that will show you the scientific name and then the common name. I typically like to do common name for this, since it is a little bit easier to understand, but especially if you're talking about common names, they can change a bit. So now we're at here, and this is a yellow poplar. So these leaves go to a yellow poplar, and you can read, you can look at the range. We're in the range. Here is the fruit. You can see the flower. Here is the stems and buds, and it'll go through, gives you the tree description, distinguishing characteristics, the habitat and range, what you can use it for. And this tells you all about the tulip tree. Now, we're in the magnolia family, so if you had a different magnolia, it may take you to a different key. And from that, you would just follow this down and decide on your tree. But that is how you use a dichotomous key to identify a tree leaf. So with that, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Again, thank you so much for all your support. And if you've enjoyed the video, I encourage you, please like, share, comment, and mention some tree species that you want to start managing for and identifying. Until next time, happy management and God bless.